Family First welcomes the Federal Coalition's announcement that it will pursue nuclear energy for Australia. For this to happen, the irrational ban on nuclear energy must be lifted. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and his Energy Minister Chris Bowen's assertions that nuclear energy is too costly and doesn't stack up are absurd. Too costly compared to what? Rolling out windmills, solar panels, a spider web of new transmission lines, plus the overpriced Snowy 2.0 hydro scheme is forecast to cost around $1.5 trillion by 2030 and trillions more in the decades to come. This is more than enough money to invest in cheap and reliable forms of power generation with cash left over. Ever since Australia went down the taxpayer-subsidised path of windmills and solar panels under the Howard government, and then started closing cheap and reliable coal-fired power stations, electricity prices have gone through the roof. Writing in his recently released memoir, Not Pretty But Pretty Effective, former Queensland Senator Ron Boswell laments that he and his colleagues did not fight to stop taxpayer money going to renewables. Ron Boswell writes, quote, "When I see homeless people on the street, I think of the billions wasted to get more expensive electricity and I shudder. I'll regret that decision not to oppose renewable energy regime for the rest of my life." Now, the cost of living and the inflation crisis being endured by families is politician-driven, in large part because of the bipartisan commitment to net zero policies. Financial pressures on families are one of the leading causes of family breakdown, which of course in turn leads to poor educational outcomes for children, poverty and of course crime. Family First has long called for a pause on net zero until proper engineering and economic analysis is done on the costs versus benefits. Sadly, the major parties, the Greens and the Teals, remain wedded to net zero despite not knowing the cost and not having invented, I should say, the storage technology needed to supply baseload electricity when the sun doesn't shine and the wind doesn't blow. The reckless rollout of renewables has only accelerated since the Albanese government took office, making Albanese's election promise of a $275 reduction in electricity bills a cruel joke. An area half the size of Victoria will need to be carpeted with Chinese Communist Party supplied solar panels, windmills and transmission lines if Labor's target of 82% of Australia's electricity is to come from renewables by 2030. The environment and farmland is being destroyed for an expensive and unreliable electricity system. That's why the Coalition's pivot this week to nuclear is important. It's why it was even more important to hear Shadow Energy Minister Ted O'Brien talking about a coal to nuclear transition. If net zero is what Australian people want, this can only be achieved via a coal, gas to nuclear transition over time without compromising affordability, reliable or the environment. Australian emissions are negligible on a global scale, so there should be no rush to renewables here, while the rest of the world, particularly China and India, continue high carbon dioxide emissions for decades to come. Nuclear power stations, including large-scale reactors, now also under consideration by the Coalition, can be built on the site of existing coal-fired power stations and plugged into existing transmission lines. Farmland and the environment can both be saved. Well, last month, Yvette D'Arth, the Queensland Attorney-General, tabled a bill to fully decriminalise prostitution in Queensland. Now, much legal sexual abuse of young women, because let's face it, that's what essentially prostitution is already legal in Queensland, as it is in most other states under various legalised regimes. Single operator prostitution, i.e. a woman or a man, usually a woman, working from home or a motel, is legal in Queensland, has been for more than 20 years, as are brothels, which have no more than 5 prostituted people, again, usually women, working in them. All the time brothels were legalised in Queensland, at the time brothels were legalised in Queensland 24 years ago, the then Labor government under Peter Beattie said it would never fully decriminalise prostitution because it believed it was not safe and that women would be protected better under its supposedly tightly controlled legal regime overseen by the the Prostitution Licensing Authority. But for the last 24 years, the sex trade has waged a relentless campaign to water down what were already bad laws so that it could achieve open slather prostitution. And that is where we are today. Now, one of the few voices calling out the Queensland Labor government for making it easier for men to abuse young women is Rob Norman, the Queensland Director of the Australian Christian Lobby, and he joins me now. Rob, thanks very much for your time. Rob, why does the Queensland government want more prostitution?
Well, thanks for having me on your show, Lyle. Appreciate it. Lyle, I can only summarise what Premier Stephen Miles might answer to that question. He would likely say this bill is about the increasing. He would say that this bill isn't about increasing the size of the sex industry, but providing protections for the state's sex workers and ensuring they have the same industrial rights as any other worker. Now, Lyle, the truth is, however, that whenever the sex industry is legalised or decriminalised, Germany being a prime example, we're going to see a massive growth in the sex trade and a massive growth in sex trafficking. So whatever the Miles Labor government might tell us about the expected size of Queensland's sex industry, in the likely case this bill is passed, the sex industry will actually explode.
No, that's right, Rob. And of course, we saw that 24 years ago, and I haven't got the statistics directly at hand, but I know the University of Queensland did a study 10 years after brothels were legalised and the illegal trade had blossomed. So this is just going to turbocharge it even further. Rob, it's extraordinary to me that one of the strongest voices supporting the government's push is the Queensland Council of Unions. Their Secretary Jacqueline King accused the government of a failure of leadership for taking so long with its move to further decriminalise prostitution. You'd think the unions would be more concerned about cost of living or youth crime or representing their members. Why are they so keen also to expand the sex trade?
Well, Lyle, the unions know the numbers. They know that once prostitution is decriminalised, their coffers will benefit primarily. But they also know that just as Germany is the sex capital of Europe, Queensland stands to gain the title of sex holiday destination of Australia. Now, this very bad bill will open the way for a neighbourhood brothel in every street, in every suburb, pimps included. And so the third-party profiteering from a large sex industry will include the pimps, the unions, and even the travel agents. And so all these will support a larger sex industry. And all along, the numbers of exploited and abused young women and even men will go through the roof.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. Well, if you put it like that, you can see perhaps there's this nefarious commercial motivation there. And we have to keep in mind that 18 is the legal age of someone working in this trade. That's the age at which many young women are working at McDonald's. And of course, there's no comparison. Rob, we've heard all this before. Of course, I heard it all 24 years ago when I was in Queensland fighting this at the time. But the existing supposedly tight legal regime that came in 24 years ago of legal brothels and single operators, it's failed to keep women safe. And you powerfully document on the ACL website several cases where women have been murdered under this supposedly safe regime. If prostitution is not safe now, how's the government claiming the new bill will make it safer?
Yeah, look, the government is in complete denial on the statistics, and at least that's the impression that that they're projecting. Their mantra is that a decriminalised sex industry will allow for better protection. Now, we know that's not true. Survivors of prostitution have told us that in New Zealand, where the sex industry has been decriminalised for over a decade now, prostituted women who have been severely assaulted and abused have sought help from local police only to be turned away. And that's because they don't have any powers, Lyle. Decriminalisation fails the women it purports to offer freedoms to. It's an abject failure.
Yeah, that's right. And of course, this has been demonstrated all over the world. And of course, we've got the Nordic countries like Sweden and Finland and many others that have adopted a model where they don't allow prostitution. Well, they allow it, but they criminalise the men. What's the feedback you're getting from the state government in your lobbying of them? Why are they dismissing the successful Nordic model, which has put a dampener on sex trafficking and exploitation of women by targeting the men rather than targeting women?
Well, statistics are very selective, and of course the government throws back at us its own set of statistics, but they're flawed and poorly researched. And so what we've found is, Lyle, that not only the government but the opposition is disinterested in any form of the equality or Nordic model. So we've proposed this alternative model to the current bill, which would essentially decriminalise the selling of sex, criminalise the buying of sex and the third-party profiteers, and provide government support for women and men wishing to leave the sex industry. Now, we know the equality model or the Nordic model works, and it is already working in several European countries. Invariably, what it does is dry up the demand for the sex industry and result in a smaller industry, and it appears that neither side of Parliament are interested in doing that.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about where the opposition under David Crisafulli, the LNP opposition leader up there, where they stand on this. You're suggesting they are ready to wave this bill through the Parliament. That's extraordinary.
Oh, look, I don't think they'll wave it through, Lyle. They may well even vote against it, but they haven't particularly been on the front foot. And I think it's been frustrating of this current opposition that they're so focused on getting into government that they're totally ignoring some of the social issues. And so that's been a frustration. There are, of course, some very good people in the LNP that are on our side with this, and I'm not going to name them, but there are one or two that are with us on it. But it's very hard for them in that current situation where the opposition is so focused into getting into government and really doesn't want to ruffle the feathers of anyone in the process.
It's hard to understand. Well, look, that's encouraging that you're hearing that they may well, and we'll have to wait and see, may well vote against this terrible bill. But the problem is, without public advocacy, and I can't see how this would ruffle anyone's feathers. I think Queenslanders would be on their side. No one wants a brothel next door, and no one wants to see the expansion of the abuse of young women through prostitution by men. And I get that there's some men involved in the trade, but it's predominantly something that preys on young women. I can't understand why the opposition wouldn't want to advocate publicly, strongly against this. You'd think that'd be a vote winner for families in the lead up to the October election.
Look, I totally agree. And if you look at Queensland, Lyle, we have a very schizophrenic situation in terms of politics. So we've got a federal situation where there are, 21 LNP seats out of a 30-seat parliament in opposition, which is quite extraordinary. And then if you contrast that to the state, the LNP needs to pick up 14 seats to win an election. So there's a complete black and white situation. I think what's going on here is that the LNP are just trying to sneak into government somehow on the failure of the current Labor government. But I agree with you totally. I think people are expecting the LNP to stand up and say, this is the direction we're taking. Are you with us? And I believe that, as you say, Queenslanders would go with them on many of the more conservative social policy.
Yeah, that's right. Time and time again, we see really bad laws going through the Parliament with the opposition, not fighting and not sustaining a debate in public so that people hear the other side of the argument.